Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Reich here, and today I am going to be going over Chapter 5 material. This is probably going to be a little bit longer of a video, so just be prepared, buckle up, and we'll get started on marriage, family, and heteronormativity, as well as technology and social networks. I also have some housekeeping I'm going to do. There'll be a little bit of review, and then I also have some other things to go over at the end when we do exit pass stuff. All right, so as far as housekeeping, you submitted your breaking a norm assignment and paper week 3, and I've slowly been going through those assignments and grading them. Some of you have received an email from me. Perhaps you forgot your notes, which are worth points if you look at the assignment rubric, or there were also some issues I noticed with citing the textbook, which I went over in a lecture video. However, I didn't want to hone in on this assignment last week because you were also preparing for your midterm, right? And you had to take that. So now we're sort of backtracking and going back to week 3 and the breaking a norm assignment. And if you need to follow up with me for any reason regarding your paper and that assignment, make sure you do that. I also did a general email to the entire class, sort of highlighting some of those issues that many folks ran into. So just have that on your radar, get in touch with me this week, and then hopefully everything will get sorted out and everyone will have a grade for that assignment in the next week. And then, of course, last night, actually, you would have finished your midterm exams. So the grades I saw early on were pretty good. I did not touch base at the end of the day to see what the grades look like for everyone, but it was looking good. So I hope you have a strong class average. But if you have any questions about a specific question from the midterm, or you just want to touch base with me about that assignment, because especially it's worth more points, feel free to reach out to me. We can communicate through email, or I'm always happy to schedule a Zoom if you would like to meet in real time virtually. All right, so moving right along to new content, we're going to start this week with Chapter 8. Again, this is all new material for you. So in Chapter 8, we're learning about marriage, family, and heteronormativity. A family is a social group usually related by marriage, partnership, adoption, or kinship. Now, there's different subtypes of families that we also talk about. So in the United States, for such a long time, especially in a post-World War II era, really the focus was on a nuclear family. So mom, dad, 2 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, the American dream, if you will, that we learned about a couple weeks ago. However, we also know that the idea of family is a social construct, which means it's constantly evolving. And so as we start to have influences from other cultures, other societies, we're seeing more and more intergenerational families living together, which is very common in other countries. And that might actually be the norm in a country that you visited, or maybe the country where your family's originally from. I know when I lived in Hawaii, I lived there for 7 years while I was doing my PhD, and they have Ohana houses there where it'll be 2 houses connected by a stairwell, and you live there into adulthood with your parents and your grandparents. And I actually lived in a house like that with my long-term partner, and her mom lived downstairs. And before that, her grandmother lived in the house with them. So if we think back to Chapter 2 and norms and what different social institutions look like within any given society, family as a social institution can look different. Now, another thing that I always bring up during this unit is, what about non-related family members? And so a great example that was provided to me in my intro social class when I was in undergrad is the show The Golden Girls from the 80s. If you're unfamiliar, it's about women who are retired and they live in Miami together. There's 4 of them. only two are related by blood. So there's a mom and a daughter, but everyone else, they're just really, really good friends and they live in this house together. They function like a family unit. And so there's an episode where one of the main characters, who is not related to her housemates by blood, she has a surgery and she wakes up and she asks the doctors, people in the hospital, where are my girls? I need to see my family. I need to see my girls. And the doctors and the nurses are like, oh, your daughter isn't here yet. We'll let you know when she is. She's like, no, my girls, my family. And she's talking about her housemates. So that's her family unit. And that's who she wanted to see immediately after having this really big surgery. And it just goes to show that the people we consider to be family don't necessarily have to be related to us by blood. Some other things to think about, especially when we get into stuff with marriage, is the economic consideration. So to have a marriage, even if you have a small wedding and you don't spend a lot of money on the ceremony, it still costs money. And so we have to think about who does that privilege in our society. And so even just going to the courthouse and getting married in that way, you have to pay money to the government to get that marriage formally recognized. And so there's a lot of economic considerations, and we'll talk about the wedding industrial complex in a little bit. Now, one thing that I find interesting about weddings and thinking about the economic aspects of weddings is when I was in college, I lived in Ohio, and Ohio voted on a measure related to same-sex partnership. And so I apologize for the noise. I had to turn off the AC unit. All right. So in Ohio, they had to vote on domestic partnership rights leading up to eventually the federal law protecting same-sex marriage. And so people were calling in and asking questions about this ballot measure that everyone in the state had the potential to vote on. And the people who were volunteering were told, oh, just say that this is about same-sex partnership. And so vote against it if you're against same-sex marriage and same-sex partnerships, and vote for it if you're supportive of same-sex partnership and same-sex marriage. But in reality, the measure actually changed all domestic partnerships. So folks who never got married for a variety of reasons, but perhaps they didn't get married because they were poor and they did not want to spend the money on getting their relationship formally recognized by the government. All of those domestic partnerships, they became domestic partners formally by living together for a certain number of years. Those also would potentially be dissolved if this measure against domestic partnerships passed. And so eventually that measure did pass and domestic partnerships were dissolved, and there were actually heterosexual couples who were in a domestic partnership, but they were not legally married. They no longer had partner benefits in the state. And so it's interesting how that issue was framed and what it means for the economic considerations we need to think about when it comes to marriage and family. It also tells us something about heteronormativity as well, which we'll talk about in just a second. All right, so the second shift is a term, it's a phrase that comes from a sociological ethnography. And your textbook covers this. So this is the idea that many women perform a first shift of paid work. So whatever job your mom, or if you're a mom, you have, or a wife, whatever you do. And then a second shift of domestic responsibilities at home. And so the researcher followed around families with young children where both partners were working full time. And her hypothesis was something along the lines of, well, since there's been an increase in women working full time, and especially in professional jobs, the domestic responsibilities around the house will be more equitable because before women were less likely to work. If they did work, they were less likely to work full time in a professional job that paid well. So the domestic work really still fell heavily on their shoulders. But with an increase in women working, that was going to equal out. And what she found is that wasn't true. Actually, even women who had higher paying jobs than their male spouses were doing the bulk of the domestic responsibilities, especially with regard to taking care of kids. And so, if we think about gender norms and what type of household chores and domestic responsibilities are masculine coded in our society versus feminine coded in our society, the chores that are coded as masculine tend to be less urgent and tend to take less time versus the domestic responsibilities that are still coded as feminine are things that have to get done on a daily or weekly basis. So there's a sense of urgency and they tend to take up more time. And so if you make a list of all of the household chores that need to be done and you divvy them out equally, by number of chores. And so men maybe are expected to take the trash out. They're expected to do lawn work, mow the lawn, take care of the bushes, whatever. And then women are expected to cook, wash the dishes, take care of kids. It might be the same number of chores, but you got to do laundry, you got to make dinner, you got to make meals regularly every single day. There's that sense of urgency. If meals aren't made, people in your family aren't going to eat, right? But if you skip trash one night, maybe there's a funky smell when you wake up in the morning, but it's going to be okay. People are going to have their basic needs met in your family unit. And also, taking the trash out takes a few minutes. Preparing a meal, at best takes 20, 30 minutes. And so we start to see how there's still this inequity when it comes to the domestic responsibilities men and women are expected to complete on a regular basis, despite the fact that we're seeing equity in the workplace. And we're going to talk a little bit more about an alternative theory to some of these issues on the next slide. Now, I mentioned heteronormativity when I was talking about that state issue with domestic partnership in Ohio. So heteronormativity is the belief that normalizes and naturalizes heterosexuality, which is sexual attraction between women and men. If we think about marriage and family, even though we do have same-sex marriage legalized at the federal level in the United States, and we continue to see other countries pass same-sex marriage rights, there's still this expectation that when we think about who's getting married, if we think about a generic couple in our mind getting married, we tend to think of a man and a woman getting married still. This normalization of heterosexuality. And even when we maybe picture a generic same-sex couple in our mind getting married, typically there's still a lot of stereotypes that exist around feminine and masculine norms where there's an expectation that one partner in a same-sex relationship is going to be more masculine, and then the other partner is going to be more feminine. But if we look at LGBTQ plus family dynamics, which there's a lot of sociological research on that, we know that that's not necessarily true. And yet these heteronormative expectations of having a masculine and a feminine partner get applied and projected onto same-sex couples. And I actually make the argument that same-sex couples can adhere to heteronormativity when they subscribe to these sort of historical, traditional notions of a masculine and feminine partner and what the allocation of domestic responsibilities should look like around the house and in a family unit. All right. The wedding and industrial complex is the escalation of wedding expenses over the past few decades. These really elaborate weddings where people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, inviting hundreds of people. And so thinking about how that perhaps connects to some of our earlier chapters where we're talking about consumption, capitalism, and that sort of thing. This idea that, well, because everyone else in our society has these big elaborate weddings, if I'm going to get married, I must also have those things. And so there's a lot of societal pressures to adhere to the wedding industrial complex. And yeah, all right. So I think the next thing we'll start talking about is, oh, whoops, this is a double slide. This is all the same stuff. So before I post this to Blackboard, I'll make sure to fix that. But the next thing that I want to talk about is the second shift, comparing it to what I would argue is a slightly more radical theoretical approach to this idea of women and their responsibilities in the family unit, as well as their responsibilities as professionals working in sort of more professional spaces, having jobs. And so this is Sylvia Federici here. This is a YouTube video of her talking about some of her research related to wages against housework. But essentially what she argues is that women have all this unpaid labor they do around the house, whether it's cooking and cleaning and some of those other examples I gave on the previous slide. Or she also talks about some other aspects. And she says marriage is a contract between spouses where women are expected to do certain things and men are expected to do certain things. And a lot of it is actually tied to finances. And so she would be what we refer to as a feminist Marxist, because she takes what Marx was saying. Remember Marx from the beginning of the semester, he's looking at conflict theory and class conflict. She takes that and she applies it to gender dynamics, and in particular, gender dynamics that exist in family units and the exploitation of women. And so she talks about how a lot of women's labor, because it's happening behind closed doors in households, in family units, it's invisible and it's unpaid. But when that unpaid labor happens in public spaces, when it becomes a profession, then it becomes masculinized a lot of the time. So if we think about cooking, women are expected to cook based off of traditional gender norms in a family unit. But if we look at chefs, especially at nicer restaurants, they are significantly more likely to be men. So if you can make a lot of money off of something that is a domestic chore that's coded as feminine, all of a sudden it becomes masculinized. And if you look at the restaurant industry and you look at chefs at the highest of high-end restaurants, it's very male dominated. And then if you start to look and see the trickle down effect, cooks at not as nice restaurants who have maybe no formal training are slightly more likely to be women. And so we start to see how that plays out. And if you're watching The Bear, which takes place in Chicago, I'm not up to date on season 3, but I started season 3. You can see how that world of high-end Michelin star restaurants is very male dominated. For more on Sylvia Federici and wages against housework, check out this YouTube video where she's giving a little mini lecture. It's not too long. Okay. Our next chapter for this week is chapter 9, looking at technology and social networks. Technology is the material objects, all the tools, machines, and devices, and cultural factors, including skills for production and use of these tools. So oftentimes when we think about technology in a lay sense, we tend to think about our computers and our phones and our tablets and all the material aspects of technology. But there's also this other cultural factor involved where you actually have to know how to use the technology. And so as we see an increase in technology in the workplace and education and all these different aspects of our everyday lives, you can't just have the technology, you have to know how to use it, right? Integral accident is the idea that technology creates its own problems that are specific or integral to technology. And so, we often think about technology making our life easier and we can get things done faster because of technological advances. But oftentimes there are unintended, unexpected, unforeseen consequences of these technological advancements. And so I remember when I was a teenager, my mom would complain about online banking, and she didn't like technology. She was stereotypical baby boomer in that way, and all of her friends were going to mobile banking, doing everything online, and she did everything by hand. She would balance her checkbook every week. And so a couple of her friends, kind of back to back, had instances where their Excel files, where they kept track of all of their banking, crashed or crapped out on them. Who knows what happened? This was the late 90s, early 2000s, and they lost all the information, all their banking information, and they didn't have a hard copy backup the way my mom did, and they were kind of freaking out. And she was like, haha, I told you so. But when stuff like that happens, those are unintended, potentially negative consequences of integrating technology too much into our lives. All right. And then moral panic is also included in this chapter. It's the widespread anxiety about a phenomenon such as new technology or groups of people such as youth that is seen to threaten society. And so when I was in college, the sort of classic sociological example of a moral panic that we used was the issue of people poisoning candy during trick or treat. Inevitably, there's always warnings every October on news channels and stuff like that about checking your children's candy and making sure it's not poison. And that's an example of a moral panic because there's widespread anxiety about this. And yet, it doesn't necessarily happen nearly as often as we think if we look at statistics and actual crime reporting of poison candy. And so with youth culture, oftentimes we'll hear about a new phenomenon like one that comes to mind that's a little bit more recent is the Tide Pod challenge that went viral. And so there's this moral panic. Oh my gosh, this is so bad. And all these youth are doing this bad thing. But we don't actually have statistics usually when a moral panic first hits as far as how often this bad thing is happening. And then when we look back at reportings later, we often find that that issue was not nearly as prevalent as we were made to believe it was. Prosumers are also covered in Chapter 9. This is the idea that smartphones and internet technology facilitate consumers turning into producers. And so if you think about collaborative content on social media platforms and stuff like that, we're consuming social media as consumers, but we're also producing content on our individual social media pages. And so we become prosumers. And then sort of leading up to that and thinking about digital creation of content, this chapter also focuses on the role of virtual communities. And so if you think about Facebook pages or other groups you might follow on Instagram and things like that, if you're really into something niche, for example, I think I said at the beginning of the semester, one of my fun hobbies, my fun fact is that I'm an avid hula hooper. I don't have a lot of friends in real life who hula hoop, so I have different social media accounts I follow for hula hooping. And so virtual communities provide this new technology that creates space for me to share my love of hula hooping, my passion. I can watch other people and learn new tricks by watching their social media accounts and things like that. But with virtual communities, people can become siloed and they can start to have sort of like this black box of ideas. And that's where a lot of conspiracy theories and fake news, belief in fake news comes from. And so we can think about that in terms of integral accident. Okay. And so with virtual communities, um, I argue that this can be space where folks from historically marginalized communities can connect globally and can potentially discuss various issues related to race, class, and gender that are happening in real time in pop culture and things like that. And so, one of my other interests is reality TV, and in particular, the TV show Survivor. And there's a lot of Facebook groups and social media platforms, Reddit accounts, and things like that, where folks talk about reality TV, including Survivor. And it's a space where people across the globe really can discuss some of the issues related to race, class, and gender that are increasingly popping up on reality TV shows like Survivor. I argue that that space, as well as water cooler spaces in real life at your job and stuff like that, if you start talking about these TV shows that are airing in real time, reality TV can be a place to complicate our understanding of race, class, and gender. And so, I want to talk about this policy here. So I believe this was in 2020. CBS reality shows, including Survivor, started mandating that at least 50% of their cast be non-white cast members. And so it was this initiative to create more diversity on reality TV shows on CBS. And it worked. Starting in 2020, Survivor had much more diversity in their casting, way more cast members of color. There were also a lot more LGBTQ plus cast members. And so it led to some really rich conversations at tribal council related to LGBTQ plus rights and race and racism and things like that. And so here is a clip that I will expect you to watch at some point leading up to discussion board 3, because it will be incorporated into the prompts. But essentially, Jeff Probst, for 20 years, whenever they were getting ready to compete in a challenge, he would holler for all of the contestants to come in, and he would say, "Come in, you guys." And he would say, "Guys." And it was brought to his attention that perhaps guys is not inclusive for non-binary and trans folks. And so he asks the entire cast, are you okay with me saying this? And they kind of pan to all of the castmates looking at one contestant who presents more queer. Like people are making some assumptions because this is early on in the season where they haven't gotten to know each other yet. And she kind of freaks out and she's like, "I'm okay with it." And everyone's like, "We're okay with it. We're okay with it." And then you'll see that eventually one of the castmates comes out and talks about his partner, who's trans, and how actually he's not comfortable with Jeff using you guys. And they talk about it. They have another conversation about it a day or two later. And everyone's like, "Yeah, like we actually are kind of uncomfortable by it too." And so he actually changes how he talks to or calls everyone in to compete in these challenges for that season and all future seasons. And so it's this situation where it's not just a sitcom TV show where they address LGBTQ plus issues once and then walk away from it. They have this ongoing dialogue about this situation, and it's messy. People don't know how to respond and react to Jeff. They don't know how to respond and react to each other. They are just getting to know each other, and they're competing for $1 million against each other. And so to me, that sort of mirrors a little bit more realistically what conversations around LGBTQ plus issues looks like in real life. And the other thing that they talk a lot about in this season is race. And so there's a 2-part clip here. It's the same tribal council, and there's a group of Black contestants, and they're talking about how historically on a lot of competitive reality TV shows, even when there have been attempts to have an all-Black alliance by Black castmates, something always goes wrong and Black contestants end up getting pitted against each other and get voted off one by one. Basically, that starts to happen, and those Black contestants who had been talking about having an all-Black alliance. They have conversations around race in real time, and there are white castmates who are with them. And we see how messy conversations around race can get. And so some of the Black contestants talk about how they feel like they are a token Black character, and they don't want people watching to think that they're quote unquote playing the race card, whatever that heck that means. And so they just have this really messy conversation around race in real time. I won't spoil too much for you if you're an avid Survivor fan, but I will say a Black contestant does win this season. It is one of the contestants who's having this conversation around race. So it's just a really interesting dynamic. And you see in real time where one of the white contestants, he's getting really upset. He's feeling frustrated. He's feeling like he's being accused of being racist. And they nip that in the bud right away, and they address that. And you see his entire demeanor change as the conversation progresses. And so it's just a really interesting dynamic. So again, watch these 3 clips on your own time. They will pop up in the prompt options for your discussion post this week. And if you're interested in learning more about the policy CBS has, you can also read more here. I will say it comes at an interesting time because not this summer, but last summer, so in 2023, affirmative action policies in college admissions, that was actually ruled to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And so you have corporations still adhering to essentially affirmative action policy when it comes to casting reality TV shows, and yet colleges and universities across the country are not allowed to take race into consideration for admission purposes. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic in our country right now. All right. The thing that I want to review this week, I know you've probably been inundated with reviews since you just took your midterm exam. I want to talk about a little bit about research methodology. And so throughout the textbook, your authors will talk about a specific research methodology at the end of almost every chapter, or throughout every chapter. And so for our purposes at the 100 level, the big takeaway I want for you all, maybe you're not going to remember all these niche research methodology types. So maybe you're not going to remember what participatory action research is, or photo voice methodology, or semi-structure interviews, focus groups. But I do want you to remember the difference between quantitative and qualitative methodology. And so quantitative research, you can break it down: quantity, quantify. This is numbers. This is survey data that we take and we do statistical analysis on. Versus qualitative research is words. So this is interview data. This is anything with a transcript, any type of text file you can analyze. So interview data is sort of what tends to come to mind when people hear qualitative methodology, but it can also be the analysis of newspaper articles or policies that are being introduced in a legislative session, which is something I often research. If you think about my Title IX campus sexual assault research for my dissertation. And so we have to always think when we're setting out on a new research project, what type of methodology is most appropriate given our topic, how we're framing it, all of those things. And so if you think about data sets and types, there's a lot of national data that sociologists will use to analyze. So you could analyze the census data. You could analyze the FBI's uniform report data, whatever that is. They have a victimization survey they do regularly. Those would be examples of survey data that you could pull from the internet. You could clean it up, put it into a statistical package like SPSS or Stata, and you could run regression analysis and other statistical modeling. Qualitative, typically, I guess I would say for qualitative methodology, you're more likely to collect your own interview data, collect your own research and things like that. But if you use the example of newspaper articles, you could go into a database that's the New York Times archives, and you could pull different articles related to your topic, doing different search terms related to your topic, and analyze that. So you could create a database of New York Times articles. And I use that particular newspaper as an example because for content analysis of newspapers, the New York Times is considered the quote unquote gold standard of newspapers. All right. That needs to be deleted too. I apologize. But here is the actual exit pass slide. So here's your regular link. I will say that there has been a lull in responses, so make sure you're filling this out. I really do try to follow up as best I can when students are responding to the exit passes. And on that note, some of the things that have come up, there's been multiple students expressing concern, interest, whatever, what have you, with financial aid related stuff. So I actually called the financial aid office this morning, talked to a lovely human who gave me some good information. And so she said, in addition to sharing the Elmhurst Financial Aid Frequently Asked Question page, that I should also share the Illinois Student Assistance Commission website. And so these both provide resources for you all in terms of applying for financial assistance. The other thing she said is on the Elmhurst Financial Aid website, there's an option where you can set up an appointment to meet with someone one-on-one. So if you look at the FAQ and you don't see your specific question answered, or maybe you need someone to help you one-on-one filling out your FAFSA and that sort of thing, you can actually set up an appointment. And I know it can be intimidating to reach out to a formal office on campus to schedule an appointment. I know I felt that way when I was an undergrad, but truly these resources are there for you. It's part of what your tuition dollars go to. So take advantage of these resources. Meet with someone if you're struggling to fill out your financial aid. And then the Illinois Student Assistance Commission can help with some other things. And in particular, students who are undocumented. This would be a good resource for you to figure out what are your eligibilities specific to the state of Illinois. So if you were one of those people who responded to some of the exit passes recently about financial aid, FAFSA, that sort of thing, take advantage of these resources. And if you would like to email me one-on-one to go over some of the issues and stuff like that, then I could help you triage a little bit better and find like a specific person at financial aid who might be able to address your specific concerns, but at least know that these resources are there for you. And then I'll end by saying, finish reading up to chapter 9. Make sure you complete discussion post 3. Remember, your individual post is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. That gives you 2 additional days to respond to a classmate. So your response to a classmate is due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. If you need to follow up with your breaking a norm activity and paper, make sure you email me one-on-one. You get your notes to me. I believe the portal to submit anything for that assignment has closed on Blackboard. So if you need to email me a document because you forgot, you can email that to me. And then, of course, have a nice week. We're in week 5. We're over halfway done. I hope everyone's having a nice summer. And the heat broke a little bit, so hopefully you're able to get outside and enjoy a little bit cooler weather. All right, that's all I got for you. I will talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.